Today we're really, well, I guess we'll look at the map briefly. We have a speaker who can talk about the topic of entrepreneurial finance with great authority, but also just somebody who has played an incredibly important role in the evolution of technology in Silicon Valley. Doug Mackenzie is a Stanford guy from his youth, but he's a Carolina person now because both of his kids, one still here, one graduated, are Carolina people. Doug was at Kleiner Perkins, where he was involved in a lot of the great deals that defined Silicon Valley, and then he left and started his own firm, Radar Partners. He is one of the important figures in the history of technology in the Valley and around the country, and where he's been a partner of Buck and mine the whole time we've been developing this innovation program, and we wouldn't be here having this class if it weren't for the involvement of Doug. So it's a thrill to have Doug Mackenzie here, and let's give him a warm ECON 125 welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
All right, volume okay?
Well, first, Holden, let me say thank you to both you and to Buck for having me here. It's an absolute honor to be here at Chapel Hill. I've always had a lot of good fun and good times coming to visit my kids here, and I've enjoyed football games and basketball games. But this is really at the heart of my love for school, is coming and getting a chance to talk to you. I've taught for several years at Stanford in the past. This is really my first opportunity talking to you. I have to say I'm also blown away by what I'm looking at here. In 1985, I was running around the country trying to sell computers, and I was in Philadelphia, and I got to speak with the Drexel University computer powers that be, and they had just made an historic decision to buy Macintoshes for all of their students. And I think this is actually the picture of what Steve Jobs had in mind when he sold the computers to Drexel. It never looked like this at Drexel. This is pretty awesome. I think it's probably obvious to all of you because you're here in this class, but this is not a class that gets offered at most universities. And I think what the privilege you have in getting to see what Buck and what Holden and what Joe DeSimone and what Julia and what Lowry Cattle, all these people have done, and John Aiken, who I met today, what all these people have done for entrepreneurship education and for the innovation. It's really a cultural thing, and it's very clear by all of you standing and sitting here that it's working at Carolina. You are the luckiest undergrads, I think, in the country to have a class like this. Now, I'm not the Jersey boys. I'm not Steve Case. I'm not Wendy Kopp. My role is kind of the backstage guy, so I might be raising the curtains for the Jersey Boys productions. But what I do is try to find the most promising entrepreneurs and the most promising companies, to identify what might make them promising, and to try to figure out how to back the very best entrepreneurs. At the end of the day, in the venture capital world, which is the world that I come from, it's really about the ones who succeed are the ones who are able to back and work with the most capable entrepreneurs. Steve Case is an example of that. Steve Case, when I first joined Kleiner Perkins, was struggling to find a way to see America Online through. The company was raised way more money than he ever asked for or ever thought he needed. It. He spent way more money than he ever thought he would. It was near dead several times, and yet you all have read about Steve Case and you had him speak, and we'll talk a little bit about how do you get from there to here. I'm the guy, like I said, I'm the guy in the back, and I've been asked a little bit about how I got here, so I will now give myself a proper introduction. And we're looking over here. Okay. So I got out of college in 1981. This was the state of the art when I got out of college. In the upper left, you see a picture of an IBM Selectric typewriter. If I was lucky, I could find one of those to compose all my papers. When I took my first job, I did program some on mini computers while I was in college, but my first job, I got to work with that Apple III computer in the lower left. That Apple III, right underneath the monitor and right above the CPU is the box. Anybody know what that box is? Anybody know? There's no reason you would. It's a 5 megabyte hard drive. That 5 megabyte hard drive it was about a $3,000 upgrade to the Apple III. But without one, it was hard to store the big VisiCalc spreadsheet models that I was building. They probably took all of 200, 200 megabytes. That's about 1 million times less than what. Did I do that? Sorry about that. We've come about 1 million miles since then, about 1 million times the capacity, what you would expect to all use, even probably 50 million times the capacity, which you all have probably on these MacBooks that you have in front of you. Let me get that back. But I got very lucky. If I did anything right in my first job out of college, it's that I embraced the IBM PC in the upper right, which was announced and shipped as I graduated. So my timing was really good. I used to tell my son the key to whatever's happened to me has been the fact that I was born in 1959 in Palo Alto and I graduated the day the PC was shipped. That was pretty lucky. But I embraced it. I went to work in a consulting firm, and I was the first individual in that firm to build a VisiCalc model, and I became the expert at building VisiCalc models for our clients. And I ended up flying all around the firm, visiting all sorts of clients in the early 80s, showing them how to build financial models first in VisiCalc and then in 123. And that landed me a job in a client startup that was starting up a computer distribution company. And as a result of that position, I got to look out across the whole PC industry in the early 80s as it was forming and get to know a little bit about who the people were, who the companies were, what the products were that defined a whole generation of innovation. And what I would say to all of you, and we'll come back to this toward the end, is that in retrospect, I look at it as I just became really good at one thing, and it ended up being a valuable position. And I think advice to all of you would just find something to be really good at. It works in mysterious ways. When I joined Kleiner Perkins, if we wind the clock forward about 10 years, I'd spent 6, 7 years in the computer business and a couple of years at business school, and came out to find the following set of high technology. The picture on the left is one of the early cell phones. Of course, you can tell from that the cell phones were only in the hands of the most innovative business people and those who lived in big metropolitan areas and had large biceps. Those were either, that's a cellular phone bag, the bag model. You could, as an alternative, have it built into your car for probably about $4,000. Upper right, you might recognize as an old thermal paper fax machine, but that was state of the art. And the lower right is the precursor to what all of you have in front of you. That was the original Macintosh portable computer, launched in 1990, state of the art. They didn't sell too many of those. But during this time, in 1990, I went to work in the venture business, and there was not a lot going on. I cut my teeth helping people like Steve Case figure out how in the world he was going to get America Online financed, help Trip Hawkins figure out how in the world he was going to get Electronic Arts financed. Have any of you heard of Electronic Arts? I think you probably know what EA Sports is. But at that time, that was a fledgling company that had very difficult time raising money. But basically, what we do with those companies, what we did then and what we do now, is we help these entrepreneurs not just get their projects financed, but grow their businesses, find the right key strategic partners, find the right key management people, the right executives to join the team, the right people who are going to make a difference in making that venture successful. And my first few years, that's the bulk of what I did. That and meeting with teams of entrepreneurs who were going to change the world, meeting with hundreds of them for probably every one investment we made, and eventually learning a little bit about how to think about financing high-tech ventures. By 1995, though, which is my 6th year in the business, a lot of things had changed. In 1995, all of these products were announced, or were the first of their kind. In the upper left, the PlayStation, which probably many of you take for granted now, that was the first PlayStation launched in '95. The first decent thin profile laptop PC, the IBM ThinkPad. Netscape, the first browser, was released, as was Java, which is the programming language probably most of you in CS are learning as an introduction. Qualcomm released the first CDMA chipset, which is kind of the first cellular data standard that brought the industry together. eBay was the first marketplace, the first plasma thin-screen TV, the Palm Pilot, which was a precursor to what many of us carry in our pockets. If you blended the Palm Pilot with that little device to its left, which is a Motorola two-way pager, you almost get an iPhone. Above that, the first digital cameras that were released, about $1,000 each. If you take all three of those and maybe throw in the PlayStation and the thin screen and the Qualcomm, you get an iPhone. This is an iPhone, but it was a lot of parts back then. And so fortunately for me, over those 15 years, I've got to see the fruits of some of those inventions and been involved with some companies you might have heard of or been familiar with over the years. I did it again. Tell me which button is on off. Is it? Or maybe I didn't do it. Thank you. But these days, I mean, some of these companies are familiar household names. Others of these companies, like Stella and Dot and WordPress, are companies that are more recent that I'm currently working closely with and trying to grow up to be worth something. That's basically what I do, and I've been very lucky to have been involved with some great people along the way. So enough about the three-slide introduction. What I'd like to do today is talk about, kind of frame the discussion in two pieces. First, talk about some concepts around entrepreneurial finance. So I don't think of entrepreneurial as finance in the classic sense. I am an investor, but I'm not really a finance guy. I'm more of a product guy. I'm more of a product, gadget, technology nerd. But in fact, there are a lot of lessons around investing that at the end of the day, you've got to help projects get their capital. All of you who might want to become entrepreneurs have to figure out how to get capital. That is a financial discipline, and we'll talk a lot about that. After I talk about some of the concepts of entrepreneurial finance, I'm also going to share some lessons I've learned and some observations I've made, some of which might be interesting to you as budding entrepreneurs yourselves. And I'm assuming that since you're here, you have some significant interest in one day joining an entrepreneurial venture or working around an entrepreneurial venture or perhaps backing an entrepreneurial investor. And everything I say today is relevant whether you're on the entrepreneur side of the table or the investor side of the table. So let's start with very basics. 3 critical fundraising techniques: beg, borrow, or sell stock. Now the good news is every one of you is already a pretty successful startup. All of you are here at Carolina. You found your way into the school. You found a way to at least partially finance your education. How many of you are here in part because you've got friends and family investing in you for college. Okay? How many of you are here in part because you've taken out student loans to borrow money to pay for college? Okay? So I would say in this room we've got representatives from the who've raised money from angel investors and who've borrowed and raised money through some form of debt for your venture. And all of that, hopefully, in the hope that you'll be more valuable, more ready for the world, more ready to take on a career and take on life when you're finished with this school. And so all of you know that in order to do that, there are some stakes. Have any of you sold stock in yourself, traded future earnings for money to go to college? We have one. In 1995 or 97, I think David Bowie. Does anybody know David Bowie music? Has he made it to your list?
He didn't make a list, but it was
David Bowie he raised something like $60 million against future royalties on his songs. I backed budding professional golfers in return for a share of their earnings. That's a typical formula used by that. So there are a few people who do that. More typical, though, is the angels and the debt. But the good news is you all know, you all have direct experience with what I'm talking about if you think about your college career as an entrepreneurial investor. Now, the bag part, which I could consider angel financing, or I think in the business world you might think about begging money to start your company from a potential customer. You might think of getting financing from a supplier who has a vested interest in your success. You might think of raising money from friends and family, doctors, networks. Angels come in all sorts of kinds. Typically that's capital that's raised out of loyalty or some sort of a common interest. Borrowing, taking down a student loan, borrowing money from a bank, that's typically the domain of bankers who expect one thing. What do bankers expect when they lend you money? Anybody? Interest. That's one thing they expect. What's the thing they expect more than anything? Collateral. Why? Because they want their money back. At the end of the day, lenders lend first with the expectation that they get their money back, and then second with the expectation that they get paid a fair return while their money is being used by you. And that fair return can vary from a very low interest rate in the case of a very low risk client, maybe a collateralized loan, somebody said, or the rates can go a little higher. My finance professor in business school used to tell us that the bankers live by the 2-4-2 rule. Take in money from consumers at 2%, lend it back out at 4%, and get on the golf course by 2 p.m. That's the old banker. That doesn't work that way anymore. And then, of course, the third thing, which we'll talk a lot about, is you can sell stock. Now, selling stock, you can sell stock or ownership or equity. They're essentially all the same thing. It's where you're actually raising money in exchange for selling part of your company. Okay? And the amount that investor doesn't necessarily care about getting his or her money back, although that would be nice. They're mostly investing because they expect a higher rate of return. They expect appreciation on their investment. They expect that the company that they buy stock in will do well enough that that stock will rise. How many of you own stock in public companies? Okay. My guess is you probably bought stock in a public company with the notion that that company's stock's going to appreciate maybe while you're at school. Maybe you'll get some dividends on the side. But if it's public, you're assuming that, you're taking a lot of things for granted. You're assuming that our government will work to protect you, the SEC will work to protect you, they're going to get proper disclosure. You're taking some risk that that company will do well, but it's a public security. Theoretically, you're taking on more moderate risk. As you get out into the venture world, where most of my experience is that you're taking on even higher and higher risk. You're tying up your investment in illiquid stock, meaning I buy stock in a startup and I can't sell that to anybody. I've got to wait until that startup maybe goes public or gets bought before I'll ever get my money back out. Whereas if you buy stock in a public company, you can change your mind tomorrow and sell that stock. So there's higher expectations on private companies and on illiquid stocks. And there's higher risks around companies that are just starting. So let's talk a little bit about why all that is. Let's talk about risk and value. When you're buying a stock, you're putting a price on it. If it's a public stock, that stock's being priced every day in the market. You know exactly what price you're paying for the stock and what the value of that enterprise is. In a private company, you really don't have any idea. You're going to negotiate a fair value, and hopefully two sides will agree on a value. But that value is a function really of three things. It's a function of cash and cash flows, expectations of future profits or future cash flows. It's over what period of time, because time, money is more valuable. You expect a return over time. It's more valuable today and less valuable tomorrow. And risk. We're going to talk a lot about risk. But it's very important to remember that more cash is preferred to less cash, right? It's important to remember that cash today or cash sooner is more valuable than cash later because of the time value of money. And it's important to remember that less risky cash is preferred to more risky cash, right? So if there's $1,000 on the table today, that's worth more to you probably than if I put $1,000 on the table and said, if it's still here in 3 weeks, you can come and get it. So for entrepreneurs, it's really important to understand these risks and to be able to put the right kind of financing strategy together. You're balancing the risk and the timing and the expectations you have for the business. And risks are very different at different stages of development. The reasons you can buy stock in IBM as a publicly traded company and expect a certain kind of return is because IBM is a tried and true company that's been around for many years. It's a predictable business. You know who's in charge, all these things. In a startup, you don't know any of that. Who's in charge might be in charge today, might be gone tomorrow. The business may be at a development stage where you have no idea whether it's going to work. Technology might not work, product might not sell, management might leave, anything could happen and often does. So understanding those risks at different stages is important. Is this not working?
It's just about to die. It's making funny noises.
Okay. Is that working? No? Yep? Okay. All right. So I was talking about understanding the relationships, being able to identify the different types of risks and understanding how those risks evolve over time and the timing of cash flows. And if you understand all that, and I know it's very conceptual and I'll get a little more specific, but being able to understand these risks and manage these risks is key to financing a venture. And if you put it all together, here are some risks that I'll use as examples. Market risk. Will the dogs eat the dog food? Okay, how many of you have read something about the Microsoft Surface tablet? Has anyone seen ads on TV? They've been all over TV this weekend. Okay, probably about a fifth of you, I'll say, are familiar with the Surface or hear that it's coming. Has anyone seen one in person? Okay, we've got about 10 who've seen them in person. That might not be a good sign for Microsoft at this stage. How many of you who've seen them think it will succeed as a product? It will meet Microsoft's expectations? That's a very bad sign. 1, 2. So this is a product that Microsoft has poured a lot of money into, probably hundreds of millions of dollars into the Surface product, not counting all the old technology they're using. And they've put a lot of careers into it. They've put a lot of money into advertising. And as of today, they still don't know whether it will succeed or not. This is an example of market risk, okay? The product works. It does what it says. It's been invented. The marketing plan is out. But now Microsoft is susceptible to the whims of the market as to whether that product flies or not. That's a very expensive type of risk. And if you wind the clock back to early stage ventures, that's perhaps the most expensive type of risk. Very hard to overcome the cost of removing market risk or trying to understand market risk. Have any of you heard of the Palm OS? Anybody heard of a company called, yeah. There's a handful of you who've heard of Palm. This was a company that developed a mobile operating system along the lines of Apple's iOS or Microsoft's Windows 8 that ran out of money. And when it ran out of money, tens of millions of dollars were lost. Then Hewlett-Packard bought the company, put in a lot of money, launched its own version of Palm OS tablet. It flopped. Hewlett-Packard lost hundreds of millions of dollars. Those are examples of market risk. Technology risk is a different type of risk. Technology risk is fundamentally, will it work? We backed a company called Bloom Energy, which is doing fuel cell. It's developing fuel cell for power generation. Terrific company. If it works, it's going to take the world by storm. The question is, will it work? Can the engineers get the technology to be reliable enough, to be cost-effective enough, and to be repeatable enough that it can be manufactured and deliver power for an economic return? We are pretty sure that if they can, the company will be extremely successful because the market will love cheaper, cleaner power. But the technology's hard. That's an example of technology risk. Management risk or team risk comes in all kinds of flavors. When you're backing early stage ventures, you're often backing managers who are inexperienced, haven't run a big company or haven't built a big company before. If we were backing any of you, there'd be a risk of, your early stage in your career. Do you know enough to run the business? Might something else more interesting come up, etc. Teams often have risk in terms of, will the executives work well with one another? Will the team scale? There's all kinds of risk around backing managements. Financing risk. A good example where you might encounter a lot of financing risk is with a pharmaceutical company developing a new drug. It costs probably a couple $100 million to develop a new drug, and there are times in our cycle where money's available, there are investors willing to take a risk on backing a new drug development, and there are other times where that money's tighter. And if you end up starting a company to discover a new drug and run out of money, you will not realize any return on that. And that's an example of financing risk. And then finally, regulatory risk. How many have used Uber or know about Uber? Just a few. You probably will as it grows, but Uber is a very interesting company. Look it up on the web after class. But it's basically a limo cab dispatching company in major metropolitan cities. And if you go to New York or you go to San Francisco or you go to Boston or you go to most major cities, you'd find this little app that finds you a cab in no time. It's sort of dispatch for cars in the cloud, if you will. As they grow, and they're growing like wildfire right now, as they grow, they're probably going to encounter taxi companies in these big cities raising up, and taxi companies can be very powerful in cities like New York, and they may have a risk on their hands about how to coexist and grow their business while somehow dealing with the threat of taxi companies, for example, going on strike. And Uber's got that coming down the road, but it's a very interesting, very promising company. So if you put all this together with some new ideas about risk and some ideas about how to think about cash flows over time and value over time, you get into some things that you're not doing in this class, I don't think, but I think for those of you who are interested in entrepreneurship at UNC, hopefully you'll get into a business planning class at some point. and you get a chance to put all of this together, which is to build a business plan, to think about how does a business grow over time, its revenues, its profits, the cost of building that business, the amount of capital that's required, when is that capital required, etc. And what you'll do is you'll build a business plan, you'll estimate the future value of that enterprise. If things go right, how big could this be, how valuable could this be based on the profitability and the cash flow characteristics of that company, and therefore, how much money do I need and how do I get that money and at what price? And you'll be able to figure out fair trade-offs. And what I've done is to put together a very simple example for in a venture, and to some of you this may be new, and to others this may be old hat, but just to give you an example of the mechanics about how financing a venture might work. Let me give you an example. So let's say there's a company around today that's basically just owned by its founders and its management team and a handful of maybe very early stage angel investors, just as an example. And let's say today that ownership is split 50-50 between the team and some of those investors. But they've got a promising business they think can be worth, maybe $100 million in 5 years, okay? But they need $5 million of capital. They need $5 million of capital to reach their goals and make this business worth $100 million in 5 years. And let's say that team has put a good business plan together for how they're going to spend that $5 million and why that company is going to be worth $100 million down the road, and they're going to start in the negotiation with a financial investor. In this case, maybe a venture investor of some kind. The venture investor is looking for a high return on that $5 million. Whereas some of us might expect IBM or General Electric or Caterpillar to grow, 8, 10, 12% per year. That's because it's liquid, it's traded in the market, it's reliable, all these other things. But here's a startup company, very early stage. It would be very typical that a venture investor might expect a 25, 30, 40, 50% return per year to take all the risks and all the illiquidity associated with that investment. But in this case, that new investor comes along, and the team and the investor negotiate that $5 million of financing will be available to that company at some kind of price. Okay? Well, in this case, they've settled on what's known as a $20 million pre-money value, or that enterprise prior to raising the $5 million is valued at $20 million, and after it's raising $5 million, it's valued at $25 million today. Okay? In the lingo of the venture world, that's known as pre-money and post-money valuation. Okay, so if you come across that in your future studies, you'll know what they're talking about. 5 million went in, 20 million pre-money, 25 million post-money, so that 5 million bought 5/25 of the stock of that company. So now the new investor owns 20%, and the founders and the team, which own 50, now own 40, because they sold 20% of their interest. The other owners own 50, they own 40, because they sold 20% of theirs. But they still have the same 10 million of value in their hands, and now the new investor has $5 million of value in their hands. 5 years forward, the company, lo and behold, is worth $100 million. It grows up. It uses that capital wisely. Everybody's earned a return. And in fact, everybody's earned about a 32% annualized return on that 5 years of time. Now, this is an extremely simple example. Many other things can and do happen along the way. But to give you a sense, this is a return that's well within the parameters that a typical venture investor might ask for. It's a return. It's an exercise in value added over 5 years that's well within examples of companies you've read about, heard about, that are successful. And it can be as simple as that. Now, other times it's not as simple as that. There are some common patterns over the years that we've all seen. And if you're in the venture business for very long, you've seen all kinds of things. You've seen companies that do what they say, but it took a couple years longer than what they said. If it takes longer, we're still happy with the success, but the returns are less, right? If it takes longer, your annual returns are less. They might have built the company they expected to build, but it took twice as much money. If it took twice as much money, they had to raise that money. They had to find it. They had to negotiate other deals with investors, and the returns also would be less, right? They'd be diluted down by that money. They might have underestimated competition. So today's plan, 5 years later, we may have not realized that there were other ventures just like ours being funded at the same time. Or there might be new products from bigger companies already in the market that eroded our margins. So we might be somewhat successful, but our business plan hasn't been reached because the margins have been low. We might have had to use some of our ownership, some of our stock, to attract key executives to the team. And so we might have given away a little bit more ownership in the company, so our share of that pie at the end of 5 years may not quite be what we hoped. And then there's also the whims of the markets, and how you realize investments in private companies is typically you need those companies to either be bought, acquired into companies for either cash or stock, or to go public. And until you're bought or go public, you're holding stock in an illiquid company. And sometimes those public markets, sometimes those windows are open, sometimes they're not. Sometimes there's a healthy environment for acquisitions, sometimes they're not. So that the timing can be dependent on factors other than just the company's own success. And I think if there's a takeaway to all this, I think it's really important to be thoughtful about managing the risks of your entrepreneurial ventures, and the financial decision making around companies that you might start or you might back or you might think about joining someday is really helpful if you can try to be honest about identifying the key risks and then figuring out how to successfully manage those risks. Ask questions like, what can go right? Or what can go wrong? Or how do I prioritize this risk or that risk? Or how do I use financing to reduce risk? Those are all questions that the entrepreneur has got to ask. So what I thought I'd do now is take a look at some of the questions that have come up and pause here before I go into some of my observations about the venture industry. And let me just take a minute to read. Are these scrolled or these? Okay. So let me address that second question, which is the technology risk seems to be the most important but the least quantifiable. How do you reconcile that predicament? Venture capitalists love technology risk more than love using venture capital to reduce or remove technology risk more than the other risks. The reason is that technology risk is something that can be although it can often be unknown, it's something that can be dealt with kind of inside the company, meaning we can control the terms on which, how much it costs to remove that risk. There's a lot of options to stop financing a company if the technology is just not going to make it. So the premise is that if the technology works and it's different enough and new enough in the market, that there won't be as much market risk. It'll be so breakthrough that if we get the technology to work, the company will work. That's the kind of venture capitalists are best at financing. It could cost a lot. Bloom Energy's raised a lot of money to build their technology. But the presumption is once it's built, and in fact now it's built and mostly working, and they've got a huge list of back orders for the power generation, for the fuel cell boxes. Because it's such a breakthrough that there's very little market risk. It's all about getting it to work. Whereas building technology and then throwing out to the whims of the market to decide whether it's going to work or not, and being forced to perhaps spend money advertising and marketing a product that you don't have any idea of whether the market's really going to work or not, is why market risk is something venture capitalists can't stand to try to reduce. The ideal company is one that is so different that we know the dogs will eat the dog food if we can just get it done. I'll talk a little bit about this as I make some a little bit more about this as I make some observations about the business. I'm not sure, if we have time, I'll come back and talk about specific companies like Uber and EA. But I think I'll save that to the end, because I think I might hit on some of those as we go. Okay. So what I thought I'd do next is talk about some lessons that we've learned. And one of the founding partners at Kleiner Perkins was a gentleman named Eugene Kleiner, who was actually part of the original team that developed the transistor that shaped Silicon Valley. He went on to found Fairchild Semiconductor Company, and then formed Kleiner Perkins with Tom Perkins in 1972. And he's no longer with us, but he was this amazing man, and one of the things he did is he wrote down a set of laws called Kleiner's laws that we quote all the time when we're arguing amongst one another in a partners meeting. A few of them I will reproduce for you. This was his first. The venture formula is easy. Just fund an outstanding team with proprietary technology in a large, rapidly growing market. It's a piece of cake. The hard part is knowing when you have done that. And everybody's looking for this. These days, there's a ton of not only venture capital, but there's financing coming from all over. So the odds of just these things don't fall into your lap. And a common misperception is that strategy and ideas are easy, or the strategy and ideas are the hard part. The idea is where the value is. That even gets perpetuated in things like, you know, the Facebook movie, which you're probably familiar with, and the famous Winklevoss lawsuit about, you know, hey, it was our idea, you stole our idea. Well, in fact, ideas are a dime a dozen. Ideas and strategy are the easy part of building value in business. The hard part is execution. The hard part is that you have to do it over a long period of time. You have to assemble a team, you have to develop technology, you have to beat your competition, you have to succeed in the market, you have to make an awful lot of really good decisions along the way. Where I come from, in our firm, we don't assign a lot of value to the idea. It's the value that gets earned over time that counts. And I think anyone who's done that will tell you. And we talk to a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of people who are very protective of their ideas. And rightly so to a point, but just keep in mind that at the end of the day, the idea doesn't do a lot for you. Related to this is a really important thing that gets also back to that technology question. If it's not 10 times different, it's not different in terms of technology or any other real great business opportunity. The competition is just moving too fast. A common mistake that entrepreneurs make is that they compare an idea that they have put together, that, let's say, some type of new technology. They compare the specs on their technology that's going to take them 2 to 3 years to develop, and they compare those specs against the specs of the competition that's in the marketplace today. So they're comparing something that they're going to take a couple years to develop, and they're saying how much better that is than what's out there today. But what they forget is that what's out there today, those companies are also developing new technology. So by the time they get their technology finished in a couple of years, all those other competitors have had 2 more years to refine their technology. So what started out, it might have been 3 or 4 times better than what's out there today. By the time those 2 years goes by, it's not better. It's maybe slightly better, or maybe slightly worse. We spent 3 product cycles when I first got to Kleiner Perkins, backing a company called Dynabook, which was a better, lighter, faster, more power efficient laptop. And each time we said, our Dynabook, the one we're going to ship, a year from now, is going to be better than the Compaq and the HP one out today. Well, by the time we delivered the Dynabook, it was essentially the same as Compaq. And so before we launched, we scrapped it, developed the next generation. Another year went by. By the time we had a product ready to ship, it was basically the same as Compaq's. Scrapped that, did a third. And before we knew it, 3 or 4 years and $20 million were down the drain because we missed this fundamental point. This is especially true. I think a lot of people A lot of entrepreneurs are attracted to cool consumer electronics devices, and you know, anything in the home, better Apple TVs, better you know, better web TVs, better TiVos, all this kind of stuff. That is the hardest of all technologies to break because of the billions and billions of dollars being spent in development by consumer electronics firms every month. And a startup trying to match that is just, once in a while there's a breakthrough, but it's very, very difficult trying to compete with that. Something, this would also maybe, in addition to being a lie, it might fall into, slightly into the words of advice. It takes the same effort to pursue a big idea as a small one. So think big. Think big. And that's certainly what we do. We think big. We you know, to organize a company and recruit a team and get really, really smart people working really, really hard on changing the world, at the end of the day, if the change is small, it tends to lead to a lot of heads banging against the wall. So a lot of people just, God, this is hard to just make it smaller. So it's really important to start with a big idea. And for a venture firm investing a lot of money, you know, if an idea is not something that can generate kind of on the order of $50 or $100 million of return to a fund that's maybe $1 billion, it's just, no matter how successful it is, it's not going to matter. They have to think big, which is also why venture capital is not for everybody. But this is a very important foundational idea. When in doubt, back great people. When in doubt, join great people. Join great teams. Great teams overcome B ideas or B business plans. I'd always rather back an A team with a B idea than a B team with an A idea. You can take a great idea and without execution, it's just not going to be terrific in the end. And oftentimes great teams can overcome those things. We'll talk about a couple of examples in a minute. Stella and Dot happens to be an example of a team. I put it up here because it's a team I'm working with now. It's a company I'm working with now. We actually started in our office with a woman named Jessica Heron, who I backed before, who I have experience with. So I know how good she is, and I know how good some of the people on the team are. And I know teams win. So it's easier to back someone you have that kind of familiarity with. We always used to say there is a time where panic is the appropriate response. The corollary, of course, is, you know, you want to be calm and patient through the process, but there is a time to panic. And I'll tell you a quick story about Citrix. Do any of you know about Citrix? Or go to my meeting or go to my PC, those apps, a few of you. It's a very, very successful software company, very valuable software company, very much at the core of kind of the whole virtualized data center and cloud computing. This was a company that we originally backed in 1990, and we backed it for one reason. It had the only third-party license to an operating system none of you know called OS/2. And OS/2 was an operating system that Microsoft and IBM, the two dominant leaders and winners of the personal computer industry, had developed together and had announced would become, all right, now I don't know, who announced would become the operating system of the future. It was going to be the successor to DOS, this preceded Windows. And along comes Citrix, and Citrix was the only company other than IBM and Microsoft to get a license to OS/2 to develop a version called multi-user OS/2. This was an absolute slam dunk from a venture point of view. You had a position in the market that was unassailable. We were promised to be the only licensee to OS/2. OS/2 was promised to be the operating system of the future that would be on every desktop in the world. Only one thing happened about 3 years later was IBM and Microsoft didn't get along so well. OS/2 didn't get developed on time, and one day, the day before a Citrix board meeting, they announced it was the end of OS/2. It was time to panic. The premise that Citrix was built on was gone. There was no OS/2, there would be no OS/2, and Citrix was developing multi-user OS 2. Nobody would ever care about that. Citrix managed to push the panic button, change the configuration of the company overnight, took it down to the core team that was working on a small part of that multi-user OS 2, a terminal server. Long story short, invented remote control and kind of industrial strength corporate remote control software, and that led 15 years later to an extraordinarily strong position in the market. Citrix is worth something on the order of $8 billion today. Another really important law and story is don't forget Plan B. How many people, can I do a poll on that real quick?
You can't do it in real time.
Can't do, okay, never mind. How many people think, just by show of hands, we put a business plan together and we go off and be successful? How many out of 100, how many times out of 100 will we be successful in the business that we set out to start in the first place? So I just gave you the Citrix example. Obviously, they were successful in the business they didn't plan out to start. But how many of you would think 50% or more companies are successful in the business they've started? Nobody believes 50%. How about 40%? 40%, 30%. Okay, 20%? I mean, 20% or more? Yeah, okay. All right, well, you're onto this. The truth of the matter is very, very few companies are successful in the company they start out, in the business they start out in. I don't know what the percentage is. It probably varies a lot by portfolio, but it's probably around 20%, 20 or 30%. Symantec was a company. This is Symantec. Are you familiar with Symantec? Everybody familiar with Symantec? Utilities, security software, big software company. Their first product was a product called Q&A, a natural language database tied to a word processor. Okay? And a few people did buy this product, in fact, but not enough to build a business. And Symantec was faced several times with the question of, do we continue to invest in Q&A and make a business out of this, or do we give up? And the investor, wrote our investment in Symantec down to zero twice. Started a company, wrote it off, reorganized, started again, funded again, wrote it off. And yet, the third time, they managed to do a deal with a company called Norton Utilities, which formed the basis for a real company, and off it went and dominated security. And the examples of Plan B are prevalent throughout the portfolio. So it's just something to keep in mind. You cannot forget that most companies succeed in areas and ways they never thought that they would. The last thing here is the best idea wins. And what I mean by this is a cultural thing. The best ideas are everywhere right now. And if you're in a company, the best ideas for your business are probably not in your company. They're probably outside. The best ideas are always happening everywhere. And the best companies are the ones that can somehow be aware and know of those good ideas and find a way to let them into their business. Find a way to admit that it's not always the owner's idea that wins. It's not always the CEO's idea that wins. It's not always the loudest voice in the room's idea who wins. It's not always our own company ideas who win. But in fact, it's the best ideas that win, and the culture's all about that. And I think this is something that probably differentiates venture-backed companies as much from other companies as any other thing, which is ideally no one is in enough control to control the ideas. In fact, I talk to friends of mine in private equity who typically, their model is they invest, they're entrepreneurial financiers, they invest and typically buy control of companies. And they typically buy control of more mature companies. And when they buy control, at the end of the day, they can decide the path, they can decide the business plan, they can decide who's in, they can decide what business to pursue, all that. In venture-backed companies, one of the basic premises is nobody's in control. A lot of founders come in and worry about 51%, 49%. To me, I want no one to have enough ownership to control. I want no one on the board to have enough seats or enough strength or enough voting rights or anything else to ever have control, because when nobody has control, the best idea has to win. The best idea floats to the top. And it's a fundamental cultural idea behind great venture-backed companies. I'll pause again and see if okay, I'm going to come back and answer those in a second. Let's keep those up there. A few final thoughts for you. And this has to do maybe a little bit more with you guys as potential entrepreneurs, as people potentially going out into the industry, looking for jobs, etc. A couple thoughts about spotting opportunity. I mentioned one already, which is becoming an expert. Someone asked me today at lunch, you know, what do you recommend starting out if you've got an entrepreneurial mindset? One is going out and finding something, and hopefully that something is the most relevant something and the most valuable something you can come up with, but be an expert. Be the best one at that. Be the best one at it in your company, be the best one at it in your school, be the best, most expert one at it in an industry, and if you do that, you've really got something. If you're an expert, people need to come to you. The best places to see opportunities for startups are often from the seats at a supplier or a customer. You know, as a customer, you know what you want, but you're not always supplied that from the companies you buy product from. And sometimes as a customer, you know more about what the right next product or the breakthrough product is than all the companies supplying the current product to you. So often from a customer seat you can see opportunity, or the same thing can be true from a supplier side. You can see, boy, if I could just deliver this much more value to the customers than another guy, I'm going to have something. And where companies get created is often from a really smart customer or a really smart supplier coming into the business. Or you can be an employee in a larger company and have a really good understanding of a product and a market. You could be at Google and know a lot about mobile internet advertising. And you could perhaps know more about it than anyone else, and you could spot that opportunity as a product manager at Google and then leave Google to start and pursue that opportunity yourself. And then this notion of knowing and being known. And what I mean by that is it's really important to have both a network of people who know you and to really be knowledgeable about a space. It's very difficult to start a company in an area that you haven't been a key part of, or that you don't have a network of people kind of looking out for you in that space. So again, in terms of career advice, you can build yourself a reputation by being perhaps in a larger company with which you're passionate about. And as you develop a personal network of relationships who look out for you, you make a contribution to their careers, they know your capabilities, and they bring you into their startup. This notion of knowing and being known is really critical. You've probably covered this. I understand you've had an historian come in and talk about failure throughout history. I will tell you about one specific company, which is just a great story of how I think about failure being perfectly okay, if it's the right kind of failure. And what I mean by that is I think if a good swing at the plate, you join a company that has a legitimate chance, a good team, it fails, but it took a good swing at the plate. There's no integrity violation, it wasn't stupid or frivolous, but it was a legitimate company like, in this case, Go Corporation and EO, which Go and EO were kind of tied at the hip. This is a pen computing company in the early 90s that was going to revolutionize personal computing with handwriting. The company went through, at that time, probably as much capital as any venture-backed company in history had gone through, and lost it all. It was a complete train wreck. The company was basically wiped off the face of the earth. There's no remnants of Go or EO by 1995. And yet, the management team of that company is a who's who of legends in Silicon Valley. Bill Campbell was at the helm of Go Corporation. Bill Campbell, since Go, went to run Intuit. He grew Intuit into a huge company with Quicken. He then has been featured in many magazines as a coach at Google. He's helped all kinds of other companies. He's probably one of the most valuable board members you could have as a startup. Randy Commissar, who is actually business development and legal at Go Corporation, went on to run Lucasfilm, a game division, and a few others, and eventually became a partner at Kleiner Perkins. Stratton Sklavos went from running OEM sales at Go to being the founding CEO at VeriSign, running that company for 10 years, actually joining me as a partner a few years ago. Danny Shader was a product manager at Go. He went on to found 3 companies and has had tremendous success. Mike Homer was a marketing guy at Go. He went on to be the founding marketing VP at Netscape and went on to great success. And I could go down 20 people at Go. That failure was absolutely a bump on the road for these guys. And it's living proof as to why failure in the valley is okay. Yeah? I thought I had till
1:40.
Yeah, it's only 30. 5 minutes, right?
We got to do 2 questions.
Okay. Oh, I had. Okay. Okay. I'll skip the satisfaction tie-in. Okay. The last thing I'd say is that let serendipity happen to you, and see the world with wide eyes as you go through this. I won't have time to develop that point, but think about that word. All right, let's talk about 2 questions. Yes, Steve Jobs did have total control of Apple. That's a really interesting question. And I don't mean to say that the best ideas have to come from outside. I think that there's no question you read a book about probably the best entrepreneur in history, and he has some terrific ideas. And I don't want to knock Steve Jobs either, but he did. But his track record wasn't always that. And I would say that Steve did consider other people's opinions. He just did it, I guess, in his own way. Don't forget, the original Macintosh was not invented by Steve. It was invented by Xerox. He realized that best idea was somewhere else. The thin panel was invented somewhere else. I think he assembled the best ideas into a vision. I don't think I have time to get too much further into that. Biggest success and failure I've been associated with, I guess there have been many. I'd say Go is one of the larger failures. Dynabook was a big failure. Two-way paging was a big failure. We tried to back two-way paging companies. And another one was a co-venture we did with TCI Cable. We launched a service called At Home, which did grow up and did provide internet services to the home on cable. But as a venture, it failed, and it was rather painful because we had really good people running that company. It proved to be very difficult to work with big corporations in the environment of a startup. Some of the successes I talked about earlier on, but companies like Intuit and Google and Amazon and Electronic Arts and AOL. Personally, I've had got a lot of satisfaction out of a couple other companies, maybe lesser known, like Visio, which was a leading drawing and graphics software company, or like Tivoli, which is a data center management company, and Stellan.today would be examples. All right.